Hello everyone, my name is Chinmayi Balusu, and welcome to our first Sammamish Tea and Science Cafe Science POV series talk. We are so excited to bring you our first presentation today evening. The Science POV series is aimed at bringing student experts in various science fields to not only talk about what they are passionate about, but also how they explore such interesting avenues of science as a high schooler or college student. We are doing this series virtually, of course, because of the COVID-19 pandemic. We hope all of you and your families are safe. Today's speaker is Chinmayi Balusu. Chinmayi is an undergraduate student at Columbia University pursuing a mix of neuroscience, life sciences, and medical humanities. She is the founder and CEO of a non-profit organization named Simply Neuroscience, which is based on interdisciplinary neuroscience education, outreach, and awareness. So without further ado, please welcome Chinmayi Balusu.
Hello there. My name is Chinmayi Balusu, and I'm really excited to be here today with you all to discuss more about everyday neuroscience connections. Discussing about what neuroscience is exactly, how it impacts us in day-to-day life, in popular media, and everything around us, basically. And tell you more about how you can get involved in neuroscience yourself if you're interested after this video. So let's get started. First, I want to discuss what exactly is neuroscience. It's something that is tossed around a lot, and to be quite frank, it comes down to studying the brain and nervous system and what goes into making us who we are, this little 3-pound lump in our brain. There's this quote from Francis Crick that says, quote, "There is no scientific study more vital to man than the study of his own brain. Our entire view of the universe depends on it." And I completely agree with this statement. Our brain is thought to be one of the most complex objects in the universe, and it can be thought of as exploring space or exploring the ocean. It is that is in depth and so intricate and unknown and mysterious in its own sense. And we're going to dive into a little bit of what neuroscience is and start off with some basics so you can learn to know how intricate it is yourself. So neuroscience, if you look it up in Google tells you that it is defined as any of the sciences that deal with the structure or function of the nervous system and brain. So neuroscience has actually been around, maybe not referred to it as neuroscience, of course, but it's definitely been around for a long time. Perhaps even in ancient Greek civilization where they studied brains and skulls and exactly the structure of what's inside our head. And even into modern times where neuroscience is definitely a field that has cutting-edge research happening and taking place on a daily basis. There are a myriad of different branches involved in neuroscience, and these are just 4 examples that I have for you that I think are very fascinating. So cognitive neuroscience is basically looking at how the brain forms its thoughts and things like attention and basic memory and such. And neuroscientists usually carry out brain activity tasks to measure exactly what is going on. So they may use tools such as eye tracking or fMRI, which is functional magnetic resonance imaging, a neuroimaging technique, to study the brain throughout these practices, basically. Now, cultural neuroscience is a field that looks at the intersection between cultural factors and our internal psychological and neurological processes. So it is a relatively new discipline and it is up and coming, but it can tell us more about disparities between different populations and exactly how the study of the brain relates to that. It can talk about cultural biases, racism, xenophobia, and things like that. What are the psychological and neurological underpinnings of such things? Neuroengineering and neurophysiology are also very fascinating fields. Neurophysiology relates more to the actual physical structures in the brain and neuroanatomy too. Neuroengineering, you can think of as combining biomedical engineering, for instance, developing different devices that can be useful to study the brain. Thinking of prosthetics off the top of my head, neuroprosthetics and neuro and artificial intelligence. There's so many things that are developing with regards to technology and engineering. So now I'll tell you a little bit more, give you a rundown of the Brain 101, starting off with exactly what the brain consists of. So the brain is the nerve center of your body, and it contains billions and billions of neurons. that transmit information from the outside world as you're going around your daily life to your body and to process in your brain. So it programs different responses that you happen. So it can be conscious and unconscious moments. Your thoughts, your emotions, your memories and such is all controlled by your brain. It's definitely your control center. And the brain is actually split into regions that are specialized for specific tasks and abilities. So it's not just one lump that somehow controls everything, but rather there are different parts of the brain that function in different specific ways. So all of these folds that you see on the brain are also not just there because they're there, they actually serve a structural and anatomical purpose as well. So everything that is in the brain is placed there for a reason and not simply there because it simply is there. So let's dive into a little bit more of major brain landmarks. The largest part of the brain that most of us are familiar with is the cerebrum, so that is sort of the front part of the brain, and it's divided into two separate hemispheres, a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. And there's a bundle of nerve fibers called the corpus callosum that actually bridges these two cerebral hemispheres, and information actually flows between the two hemispheres and is coordinated through this structure called the corpus callosum. Now, the surface of the cerebrum is actually deeply folded layers of nerve tissue with all of those different sulci and gyri that is called the cerebral cortex. And we'll be talking more about exactly what is in the cerebral cortex, how is it divided up. And that is through what are known as lobes of the brain. And each of these lobes has sort of a general and specialized functions. The frontal lobe, as you can see in this diagram here, is the blue part. It is at the front of your head, the front of your brain, above your eyes, so right around here. And this is involved in sort of higher level executive functions like planning and problem solving and thinking, but also it helps coordinate voluntary movements in speech and our memory and our emotions as well to a certain extent. Now the next part is the parietal lobe, which is in yellow. That should be right around here, we would say. And that is the top of the brain. It's behind the frontal lobe. And this is more involved in processing taste, integrating different signals that we get from our skin, such as touch, and some visual information as well. But to be completely honest, the occipital lobe is the one that processes visual information primarily, so what we see. And the occipital lobe is at the back of our head, right around here. And it can also help out with recognizing colors and shapes as well. Now, the last lobe of the brain is known as the temporal lobe, and it's the one listed on green in this picture. It's sort of below, tucked underneath the different lobes, below eye level, so I can't exactly point you to it since it is sort of in the under part of the brain, and I can't put a finger or something inside of my skull. But this is involved with visual processing and some auditory information being hearing, sounds, and such. So processing that, it's implicated in those parts. Now, this isn't just everything that's going on in the brain. These are just very general ways that we structure and assign sort of functions to different parts of the brain. There's also parts known as the limbic system and the thalamus and hypothalamus that are involved with hormonal regulation for men and women. They are involved in memory creation and regulating emotion and motivation and so many other different parts of the brain. This is just touching on a very general level, and it's really fascinating to dive into specialized structures if that is something that interests you. I find neuroanatomy completely fascinating. So, like I mentioned before, there's a very large number of neurons in the brain. There's 86 billion. Now that's a lot of zeros. And can you imagine how 86 billion neurons are packed into our brains? Honestly mind-blowing. So what exactly are neurons? They're basically cells. I mean, we have skin cells, heart cells, lots of different cells. Stem cells are really popular too. So a neuron is a specialized form of a cell that can transmit these electrical impulses and signals to other nerve cells, other neurons, or muscles, or even glands, like the pituitary gland, things like that. Now, the neuron also has its own sort of function that determines the way, the structure that determines the way it functions. There is a dendrite that receives information from other neurons. The cell body is where the neuron's nucleus is, so sort of the headquarters of the cell. And then there is the axon and the axon terminal, where a signal, an electrical impulse, is passed from receiving it at the dendrite to sending another signal off to another neuron from the axon, through the axon. So now we've spoken a little bit about sort of the general framework of the brain on its most minuscule level at the neuron, and I hope that gives you a sort of sense of scale of different parts in the brain. And now I want to tell you a little bit more about why neuroscience, studying the brain and nervous system, why it's important, and why specifically interdisciplinary neuroscience is important. Interdisciplinary being bridging the gap between different fields and their relations to neuroscience. So these are all different pictures of things that are related to neuroscience. Music, and the music that you hear in movies, the way that songs are formatted and written, is all related to how your brain processes sound, for instance. This artwork on the top right corner was actually inspired by neuroscience. Perhaps those are the intermingling of different axons from neurons that we see in this picture. Movies such as Inception and Inside Out heavily take from neuroscience and psychology concepts, and they're quite factual in some regards. There's also the neuroscience of fear. I mean, when we see a horror movie like It, why is it that we react a certain way? Why is it that we get stressed and we activate our fight or flight response, things like that. And also there are more sort of abstract concepts that we talked about. I mean, Dr. Emil Seth's talk here at TED Talks about how brains hallucinate for conscious reality, things like that. They're much more intricate. These are all different applications of neuroscience in popular media, and that underlyingly influence our everyday lives, but we don't necessarily think about it. Neuroscience is greatly prevalent in every aspect of our life. So these are just some examples of fields that are implicated in interdisciplinary neuroscience. Artificial intelligence, for instance, neuropharmacology is looking at how drugs affect the brain. Neuroethics, I mean, what is brain death? What is consciousness? Explores topics such as that. Space neuroscience is also a more recent field that explores what happens to people's nervous systems and brains and central nervous system when they head off into space. Neuroart, looking at diagrams and pictures of neuroscience and how that is translated into a more accessible means for many people who aren't necessarily in the field. They might also create some very vivid images that we might see in neuroscience textbooks. And then, of course, there's also a very important aspect that affects us very commonly, mental health and psychological well-being. I mean, psychiatry and psychologists and therapists are very important and a very crucial link to neuroscience and psychology. Now, I've spoken a little bit about different fields that are related to neuroscience, and sort of to pique your curiosity, here are some interesting neuroscience careers that people pursue. I know there is a common stereotype that everyone who is involved in neuroscience will likely go into medicine, and while it is somewhat true, a lot of folks do tend to go into, neurology, surgery, and different medical specialties after pursuing neuroscience in perhaps early schooling or majoring in it in college. There is a multitude of ways that you can get involved with this field, perhaps very directly or maybe not even that directly. There are multiple scales and levels and things that you can get involved in. Journalism, for instance, there are many neuroscience communicators and that communicate to the general public, that contribute to the large scientific publications that we see. Academia is referring to research. So you might think of professors in college or postdoctoral researchers with a PhD or an MD PhD degree who are involved in academia and contributing to cutting-edge research. There's also science educators and science policy. I mean, neuroscience is extremely important in informing governmental officials about legislative practices, for instance, in new bills that are introduced in the government. Of course, talked about mental health before. Art is also a wonderful way. Many artists have said that they have been inspired by the brain or its underpinnings to some extent. So there are a multitude of ways you can get involved in neuroscience. I mean, it doesn't have to just be medicine. It can be as bridging as many fields as you wish. I know some people who are involved in neuroscience and public health, for instance. Neurophilosophy is very interesting as well. So it is honestly, there's so many ways you can get involved with it. It doesn't necessarily have to be in one particular field or another. Now, one of your questions may be, how can I get involved with neuroscience as perhaps a young middle school, high school, college student? Now, one part that people may encourage you to do is self-study neuroscience. You can look into fascinating books, look into resources that are available online, and teach yourself more about, such as the introduction that I gave you to the brain today. Learn more about the brain, nervous system, and such on your own through different resources online. There are some very fantastic books written. Do No Harm by Dr. Henry Marsh is one of my favorite books about neurosurgery and his experiences with that. YouTube is also a great way to solely immerse yourself into neuroscience. There are some fantastic TED Talks and fantastic neuro YouTube channels like Neurotransmissions by Dr. Ali Caldwell that are absolutely intriguing. You should keep an eye out for workshops and lectures that are happening online. I highly recommend subscribing to newsletters of different universities, for instance, that may hold public outreach programs. And of course, there's also a great way to keep up with neuroscience news on social media. Maybe follow organizations such as the Dana Foundation, Society for Neuroscience, and such for interesting new developments in the field of neuroscience. And of course, you can also get involved with youth organizations that are related to neuroscience, such as my own nonprofit, Simply Neuroscience, as an example, which is based on interdisciplinary neuroscience. And I think that finding those communities of students who are involved and share the same passion with you about neuroscience is really valuable early on. So I highly recommend you do look into that. All right, thank you so much for tagging along with me today in this little session about everyday neuroscience connections. If you have any questions, you can feel free to reach out to me on social media through LinkedIn, or you can find me on Instagram and Twitter at Chinmayi_Balusu. I want to wrap off with a quick shout out to Slide Carnival for the slides template and to the Simply Neuroscience Brain Resource Creation team for actually creating the resources about the brain and the neurons that I showed to you earlier in this session. So thank you so much once again for tagging along, and I sincerely do hope that you consider looking into neuroscience in the future. Here's to your brain journey.
Thank you so much, Chinmayi, for that insightful and inspiring presentation. We truly enjoyed learning about the brain, nervous system, and the variety of applications to everyday life that neuroscience holds. Like Chinmayi mentioned, if you have any questions for her or just want to reach out, be sure to reach out on her social media. Or you can email us your questions at samamishtscn@outlook.com or DM us on Instagram at samamishtscn, and we would be happy to connect with you. And thank you to everyone who joined us today. We truly hope you have enjoyed this first talk in a series of many this summer. As this is a series, we have to shout out our next talk in the series on Tuesday, July 28th at 4 p.m. PST. We have a talk from the amazing Christine Yi on exploring gravitational waves and the stellar graveyard. Be sure to join that talk and the many more to come during the summer on Tuesdays at 4 p.m. You can stay up to date with us on our Instagram and be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. Thank you all once again and stay safe.